You're in the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt at 18,000 feet over occupied France. The air is thin, the sky vast, and by every rule you've been taught, that altitude is safety, altitude is life. But you're not safe. The sun hides predators. Shadows dive with impossible speed. The instruments whisper warnings you can't outrun. So why would you ever choose to fly so low you could scrape the paint off a barn roof? Because up here, the rules are killing you. Because down there, amid trees and church steeples and smoke, lies a dangerous kind of freedom, the only kind that might keep you alive. In the summer of 1943, 18,000 feet didn't feel like safety. It felt like a trap. From that thin, cold air, you could see for miles, honest and open. You could spot targets, you could think you had the advantage. But visibility was a lie. Up there, encounters happened fast and death even faster because the skies were crowded with veterans who knew how to turn altitude into an ambush. Planes that climbed to survive found themselves exposed, silhouetted against the sun. Pilots who followed the rules found themselves suddenly alone, watched by eyes that had learned how to kill from above. The 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging pilots and planes. In just 3 catastrophic months, 214 fighters vanished from the roster, torn from the sky, burned out on runways, or simply not coming back from escort. Those weren't statistics. They were squadron mates, trainers, the hard-earned instincts that kept formations alive. Airframes could be ordered and shipped, but seasoned pilots could not be conjured overnight. Airfields began to echo with empty bunks and silent helmets, while maintenance crews ran ragged. Commanders watched their margin for error collapse. The crisis forced a brutal question. If the rules were killing you, could you dare to break them? Numbers tell only half the story. The other half is human. Planes were vanishing faster than new men could be trained or ferried across the ocean. Squadrons bled pilots by the week. Replacements arrived raw, green, and often hopelessly outmatched. Maintenance yards couldn't build aircraft as fast as combat chewed them up. The result was a cold, brutal math. Attrition outpaced reinforcement, and the Allies were losing the sum of that equation. Morale frayed. Commanders grew desperate. Entire tactics that worked in theory looked lethal in practice. And waiting above all this attrition, ready to exploit every weakness, was the veteran Luftwaffe. The enemy was the veteran Luftwaffe, not green boys, but hardened professionals who had flown these skies for years. In their hands, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf F-190 weren't just planes. They were extensions of ruthless skill, fast, nimble, brutally efficient. Their pilots knew every thermal's lift, every cloud break, every weakness in an escort formation. They learned to strike like lightning from above, to use sun and speed as conspirators. Facing them felt like stepping into a predator's kitchen, opponents who had turned altitude into an art and killing into grim routine. They called it the bounce, a ruthless little ritual perfected over years. A Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf would hide in the sun, then fold over on a knife-edge dive, guns spitting, hit the formation in a heartbeat, and vanish into sky and light before anyone could even point a finger. It turned height from a refuge into a hunting ground, and left American pilots stunned and exposed. To every new pilot in the 8th Air Force, doctrine wasn't a suggestion, it was gospel. Altitude is life. Climb high, hold the energy, trade height for speed when you need to strike or escape. Up there you could dive, burn off speed, yank into a hard turn, and still have the power to peel away. You could protect the bombers from above instead of chasing shadows below. Instructors beat it into you between classes and briefings. The phrase was whispered in bunk rooms and stamped on checklists. It promised a clear, calculable advantage, the defensive energy edge that was supposed to keep you alive. But that gospel was failing. The problem wasn't bravery or skill, it was predictability. The Luftwaffe had studied the Americans, learned their climb and stall patterns, and turned altitude from an advantage into a trap. Hidden by sun and cloud, German fighters would dive like hammers, strike with brutal surprise, and vanish before anyone could react. Pilots who trusted the rule "altitude is life" found themselves funneled into the exact positions the enemy wanted them in: visible, vulnerable, and exposed. What was supposed to buy seconds of energy now cost lives. The doctrine that had been drilled into every recruit had become, quietly and terribly, a predictable death sentence. Major Hub Zemke watched it like a slow-motion disaster. Planes that left full strength came back in ragged formations. Names were crossed off the roster. Flight logs read like obituaries. He saw boys he'd briefed that morning never again laugh in the barracks. Each return brought fewer faces at the debrief, fewer pilots in the ready room, fewer men willing to volunteer for the next mission. It wasn't abstract statistics to him, it was personal, and it sharpened into a hard, cold anger. The rules weren't saving anyone. Night after night he saw the empty chairs multiply in the mess hall, each one a ghost. Night after night he watched the empty chairs multiply in the mess hall, each one a pale accusation, a ghost of a pilot who had done everything right and died anyway. Plates went cold. Boots sat abandoned under tables. Cigarette boxes dwindled. Laughter thinned into a polite silence that never quite filled the space between men. Faces that used to trade barbs about leave and girlfriends now stared at ceilings or at the little memorials pinned to the corkboard. To Zemke, those empty seats were not statistics. They were names, smells, morning routines erased. A quiet, accumulating horror that started to feel like a verdict against the rules. The casualty lists kept arriving like bad weather, longer, colder, more certain. Night after night, Zemke watched empty chairs multiply in the mess hall, names scratched into rosters, faces that didn't come back. Frustration curdled into something sharper, a cold, calculated anger that didn't rant or despair. It cataloged, it measured, it looked for patterns. Every rule he'd been taught felt less like salvation and more like a funeral march. Altitude is life, they had said. It wasn't saving them. The rules weren't working. And that realization began to change him from grieving officer into a man who needed answers. Night after night, the mess hall told the story. Empty chairs, silent places at noisy tables, faces that would never come back. Zemke watched that arithmetic of loss like a man watching a wound refuse to heal, and slowly his anger hardened into a single, impossible question. The gospel they'd been taught, altitude is life, began to look less like wisdom and more like a script for inevitability. What had been command doctrine turned, in his head, into a series of assumptions begging to be tested. He didn't just doubt tactics, he began to doubt the very framework they'd been told would keep them alive. It started as a quiet, dangerous seed in Zemke's mind. Heretical, a direct gut punch to every doctrine he'd sworn to uphold. Every training manual, every briefing slogan he'd drilled into fresh pilots now sounded like a litany leading them to slaughter. He could see the empty chairs. He could hear the mothers' names on casualty lists. To even entertain the opposite of altitude is life felt like betrayal, like trading discipline for madness. Still, the idea wouldn't leave him. Maybe the rule itself was the problem. Maybe survival demanded breaking the rule. The thought was simple, terrifying, irreversible. Zemke sat in the mess hall, the rule drilled into him since flight school echoing in his skull. Altitude is life. But the empty chairs kept whispering otherwise. The thought that began as a whisper hardened into a dangerous question. What if staying high, holding precious energy above the clouds, wasn't saving them at all? What if it made them predictable, visible, and vulnerable to the Luftwaffe's sun bounces? It wasn't blasphemy, it was arithmetic. Losses added up. Men died following the gospel. He pictured a different calculus, a radical inversion that traded heaven for the ground, a plan that could kill them faster or finally keep them alive. What if altitude was the problem? The question landed like a live grenade in Hub Zemke's head. Sacrilege against the gospel every new American pilot was fed. Altitude is life. Up at 18,000 feet, the math promised safety, but the result was slaughter. The same height that gave energy also made them predictable, visible, and perfectly set up for the Luftwaffe's deadly bounce. Night after night, empty chairs at the mess table turned frustration into a hard, cold anger. To suggest diving toward the ground, to trade the clean rules for something reckless and raw, sounded like heresy. But when doctrine is killing your friends, heresy becomes a moral imperative, and that thought would not be contained. The breaking point came. Losses weren't statistics anymore. They were faces at the mess table and names on a roll call, and they were multiplying with terrifying certainty. Zemke did the arithmetic in his head, and it gave him only one brutal conclusion. Obeying the rules was a faster route to the cemetery than bending them. Anger turned clinical. He stopped being a dutiful officer for a moment and became a surgeon cutting out the infection, willing to risk court-martial, scandal, even his career if it meant saving lives. The choice was simple, awful, and immediate. Follow doctrine and die, or break it and maybe survive. Zemke didn't just get angry, he had a dangerous thought. The kind that feels like mutiny the moment it arrives. A forbidden experiment to flip everything they'd been taught. Imagine trained pilots, the gospel of altitude drilled into them, being told to forget it. To peel off from the escort, push their noses down, and fight where the trees bite at your wings. It was insane on paper, a violation of doctrine and of every survival instinct they'd ever been taught. But the math of loss was merciless, and for Zemke the choice narrowed. Keep following the rules and die, or break them and maybe live. The logic was simple and terrifying. Fly low and you disappear. At treetop level, the sky above becomes a blind spot. No time to spot a diving Me-109, no room to trade altitude for speed, no margin for error. One misjudged turn, one clipped branch, and you were suddenly part of the landscape instead of its master. Every training manual called it suicide. And yet, that very predictability, everyone playing the altitude game, was the point. If the Luftwaffe expected you up high, maybe the only way to survive was to stop playing by their rules. It was a brutal gamble. Zemke decided to test it. In September 1943, Hub Zemke called 3 pilots into a dim briefing room and locked the door. No slides, no witnesses, just hushed voices and cigarette smoke. He laid out a plan nobody was supposed to hear, a rule-breaking experiment born of failure. They listened, careful, hungry, grieving men who had watched the mess hall chairs multiply and agreed to fly a mission that could get them court-martialed or killed. He told them to forget everything they'd learned. After their next bomber escort run, they weren't to climb for safety, they were to drop, all the way down, skim the trees. It sounded insane. Every trainer's voice in their heads screamed suicide, but Zemke leaned in and framed it like a single, brutal promise. Survival meant abandoning the gospel of altitude and trusting the earth to hide them. He didn't soften it. He said, plainly, that if this mad gambit got them nailed, if the brass found out and dragged them before a court-martial, he would take the blame. All of it. Every reprimand, every paper, every possible punishment would land on him and him alone. It was an ugly offer, spoken without flourish, but it did something the manuals never could. It shifted the risk from individual pilots back onto command, and in that shift, it bought them something rare in war, permission to try the unthinkable. In the hush that followed, The weight of his promise hung heavy, daring them to answer. They sat in the dim room, and the only sound was the clock and the memory of names. Young faces missing from the mess hall, scraps of letters, the last laugh that never returned. Zemke had offered to take the blame. Now the choice sat squarely with them. They looked at one another, and it wasn't bravado or bravado's echo. It was fatigue made into resolve. The current way had become a slow march to the grave. So, quietly and without ceremony, they agreed. Better to risk a court-martial than to keep dying by the book. The plan was terrible. It felt, suddenly, like the only sane thing left. On September 27, 1943, the experiment began. 3 P-47 Thunderbolts quietly peeled away from the returning escort, slipping off the edge of formation like shadows. Inside their cockpits, silence replaced chatter. Only the raw rumble of engines and the click of instruments. For a heartbeat, they hung between obedience and rebellion. Then, with a single tacit nod, they eased into the forbidden descent. Instead of climbing to safety, the 3 Thunderbolts pushed their throttles forward, noses dropping as the world flipped into a furious blur. The roar filled the cockpits. G-forces pinned them back. Instruments quivered. For a heartbeat, their training screamed, "Pull up!" And then they held steady and committed to a deliberate, terrifying dive from the heavens toward the French countryside. They plummeted past 10,000 feet, then 5,000. The altimeter needle spun, the wind turned into a howl, and every muscle in the cockpit tensed. Years of training screamed at them to yank the stick and climb. For a breathless, terrible moment, they almost did. And then they kept their hands steady and held the course. They leveled out at just 200 feet above the French countryside, the ground a violent green blur. Instruments rattled, wind roared. The Thunderbolt's bulk felt wrong this close to the earth, yet the pilots held steady, eyes pinned to hedgerows and church steeples, hunting landmarks instead of sky, a deliberate, terrifying ballet between metal and ground. Below, French farmers working in their fields heard an apocalyptic roar and dove into ditches as the 7-ton fighters thundered past. Horses reared, windows rattled, dust and wheat exploded in the P-47's wake, and a scarecrow toppled like a struck man. Men pressed faces to mud and counted their blessings as the monsters streaked overhead. The pilots barely spared them a glance, eyes locked on a distant church steeple, a river bend, navigation by landmarks at treetop speed. They picked their road like hunters. A church steeple, a winding river, a switchback of fields. At 200 feet, the world blurred into a green smear, every fence post a waypoint. They threaded valleys and hugged hedgerows, throttles jammed forward, faster and lower than they'd ever dared. Each landmark a tiny promise that the airfield would be there and the surprise would be theirs. Their target was a German airfield, a neat grid of runways, hangars, and complacency. For a breath, it was quiet. Then 3 P-47s screamed over a line of trees and burst upon the base like a storm breaking. Engines ripped the air, dust and loose tools flew. They skimmed rooftops and hedgerows, hurtling past steeples for cover, timing everything to the last heartbeat. There was no buildup, no warning, only the sudden thunder of American firepower. Men froze mid-task, heads snapping up as the sky turned violent, and the airfield, too late, it had been ambushed. The Luftwaffe was caught completely by surprise. Mechanics snapped their heads up, grease-stained hands frozen mid-motion, mouths open around half-formed shouts. Hangar doors hung ajar. A fuel truck sat idle. A ladder leaned against a wing. Pilots still tugging on goggles. Everyday routine turned absurd by the roar overhead. For a heartbeat, they simply stared, disbelieving, as the P-47s carved the sky into noise. There was no time to scramble crews, no time to man guns. The moment stretched, and then everything happened at once. The P-47s ripped into the airfield, guns spitting, barrels blazing. 8.50 caliber Brownings per ship chewed through parked Luftwaffe fighters like a saw through paper, sending fire and shrapnel along the ramp. Mechanics dove for cover. Wings peeled back, fuel tanks ignited, and the sudden, brutal thunder of American guns left no doubt. The surprise had become carnage. They ripped across the ramp in a single, devastating pass, 7 tons of Thunderbolt and 8.5 spitting fire. Tires burst, canopies shattered, wings sheared. 4 FW-190s erupted in flame and twisted metal. Ground crews scrambled, mouths open, as the P-47 skimmed the treetops and melted back into the countryside, leaving the airfield a smoldering ruin. Before the airfield's flak cannons could even get a bead on them, the Thunderbolts were gone, vanishing back into the landscape.
Eine Sekunde, die deutsche Rampe war ein smoking Ruin. Der nächst durch 7-Tonnen-Maschinen waren Strecken low über Felder und hedgerows, engines screaming, blenden into shadows und smoke, als sie treadet their way home, fuel tanks running thin und Adrenalin high. Die coasted back ins den Field mit nichts mehr als Dust auf deren Tires und dem Smell of hot metal in ihren Trotz. No bullet holes, no smoking engines, just 3 battered Thunderbolts und pilots who felt oddly alive. Fuel gauges hovered on empty. Radios waren silent, aber their brains waren laut, replaying every second of the dive at 100 differenten Schwierigkeiten. Adrenalin machte dem Talk fast, dann fallen quiet. Was hat fällt like ein crazy gamble, nun schmellt like opportunity und danger. Weil was immer wirkte da draußen in den Träsen, könnte der hohle War klären. They hadn't just survived a suicide mission.
They had stumbled upon the enemy's fatal flaw. In the debrief room, the relief and disbelief braided with a cold, electric excitement. This was no fluke. What they'd done exposed a pattern, a weakness hidden in plain sight. The landscape itself could be used as a cloak. Suddenly, everything taught to them looked like a liability. Suddenly, surprise could be manufactured, and the hunter could be lured into fighting the ground instead of the plane. For men who'd watched friends die by the book, that realization felt like salvation and a summons. Terrifying, because it forced them to break every rule, and brilliant, because it might win the war. Back in the debrief, the air felt charged. Excitement, disbelief, a kind of savage relief. They replayed the run, the dive, the trees, the way the airfield went from quiet to chaos in a heartbeat.
At treetop level, German radar was effectively blind. The instruments that made them masters of the sky were useless against ground clutter and terrain masking. Suddenly, the surprise wasn't luck, it was physics. They'd found a way to vanish into the landscape, strike, and be gone. A dangerous trick, but one that made victory possible. What the debrief peeled back was simple and savage. German radar didn't fail because it was broken. It failed because the countryside was noisier than a radio could handle. Radar pulses bounced off hedgerows, church steeples, patchwork fields, and rippling rivers, throwing up a chaos of echoes the operators couldn't sort from a real aircraft. At treetop level, the returns became ground clutter, a shimmering wall of false blips that hid anything moving inside it.
In practice, that meant a formation could melt into the landscape and pop up like a ghost, unseen until the guns were already spitting fire, a terrifying, game-changing blind spot. It wasn't just an edge, it was obsession-level dominance. At treetop height, the P-47s vanished into the map like specters. Radar signals became useless noise, swallowed by hills, hedgerows, and rooftops. Pilots could slip in under the enemy's nose, unleash everything those 850s could do, and be gone before a single alarm finished ringing. Surprise stopped being a tactic and turned into a weapon you could schedule. The math changed. Attacking the airfield on the ground was cheaper, safer, and devastatingly effective. Zemke's forbidden experiment stopped being a gamble. It was a proven, revolutionary way to fight. Zemke's forbidden experiment stopped being a hypothesis the moment those thunderbolts slid back onto the airfield. It worked. What had sounded like lunacy on a briefing sheet had become a battlefield fact. Radar blinded by ground clutter, surprise as lethal as any cannon, and the whole power balance flipped in an instant. Panic turned to exhilaration in the debriefs. Training manuals felt obsolete. But this was no harmless triumph. This new reality demanded secrecy, discipline, and a cold calculus. Use it and win, or reveal it and risk a counter that could cost more lives. For the 56th, desperation had birthed a weapon that could change the war. They had a weapon. Not a secret bunker or a new engine, but a way of fighting born out of pure, stubborn desperation. A tactic that turned the rules inside out and handed the 56th Fighter Group a hidden edge. What started as a hush-hush experiment became doctrine. Treetop attacks that made radar useless, surprise strikes that felt like ghosts moving through the countryside. It changed how pilots thought about danger, not as something to avoid at all costs, but something to be used, manipulated. Suddenly, the men who'd been waiting to be hunted were hunting instead, and the balance of the sky had just begun to tilt. It worked so well it almost felt like cheating, sudden, savage, and complete. The Allies weren't just surviving anymore, they were dictating the terms of engagement. Where once altitude gave you the edge, now trees, hedgerows, and church steeples became weapons in an aerial chess match. German pilots who expected easy prey found themselves spat out of the sky by an enemy that seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish the next instant. Morale on the ground and in the cockpits flipped. Luftwaffe timing and doctrine were thrown into chaos. In short, the whole dynamic of air combat had been turned on its head. The hunter was about to become the hunted. When a German fighter spotted a P-47 on the deck and dove to give chase, the game reversed. He dove full tilt, only to find the rules had changed. At 50 feet, there is no margin for error. Every turn risks the earth. The American used valleys, steeples, and hedgerows like armor, and suddenly the hunter was the one looking over his shoulder. At 50 feet, everything shrinks to a blade. Reaction time, margin for error, mercy. You're doing 400-500 miles an hour, and the world below isn't a map anymore. It's a moving obstacle course of hedgerows, telegraph wires, church spires, and blind gullies, each one a potential coffin. There's no time to think, only to do. A half-second lapse, a fingertip too heavy, and the sky converts to ground in an instant. Pilots learn to stare through terror, to treat terrain as a weapon and a threat, because when you're that low, the enemy you outrun is often the planet itself. It wasn't just another enemy in a black fuselage, it was the planet itself. At 50 feet, the sky stopped being a battlefield and the earth became a trap. Hills, hedgerows, wires, church steeples, and river bends suddenly had the power to kill you faster than any cannon. The German pilot, locked into a fight, had to think not only about outturning an American Thunderbolt, but about not turning into dirt. Every maneuver carried a new, terrifying calculus. Pull hard and risk the ground. Hesitate and lose the shot. Press on and invite a fatal mistake. The terrain wasn't background anymore. It was a weapon aimed back. Every aggressive maneuver, every steep bank or dive carried the same brutal math. At 400 miles an hour, a single mistake didn't mean a spin or a comeback. It meant meeting hillside and trees head-on. There was no graceful recovery, no time to stall. Rivers, steeples, and hedgerows became sudden executioners. Pride turned to white-knuckle terror as pilots realized they weren't just dodging an enemy plane anymore. They were fighting the ground itself. Suddenly, the hunter was terrified. German pilots who'd spent years perfecting the swoop found themselves lunging into a landscape that fought back. Trees, valleys, church steeples, the very curves of the earth became an invisible arsenal. The P-47 pilots hugged the ground, used hills as curtains, dove into winding river valleys, and ripped straight through villages so close the steeples could blot out a pursuer's sightline. At 50 feet, there was no margin for error. Every aggressive move risked the planet itself. The Americans stopped fighting in the sky and let the ground become their weapon. They dove into winding river valleys, threading the P-47s through green canyons carved by water. At treetop level, the curves of the earth became blind alleys, banks, bends, and shadowed hollows that snapped line of sight like a curtain. A pursuer who followed would lose sight in a heartbeat, forced to climb or crash. The landscape itself swallowed attackers and left the thunderbolts ghosts. They'd fly straight through sleepy French villages, engines snarling, church steeples stabbing the sky like living shields. A pilot timed his pass so the steeple hid his approach. The pursuer had to pull up or risk smashing into rooftops. The tactic turned sanctuaries into armor. Small towns became traps that robbed a hunter of his altitude and his nerve. The Luftwaffe owned the sky, so the Americans simply stole the ground from under them. Treetop runs became the new tactic, swooping in under radar, threading river valleys, skimming church steeples and hedgerows until the enemy couldn't see them until it was too late. German fighters, trained to dominate the blue, found themselves fighting the earth instead of another plane, forced to climb or crash. It was brutal, improvisational air warfare, a psychological reversal that left the Germans unnerved, and oddly, the bulky P-47, built for high altitude, was about to prove terrifyingly well-suited to the job. It was the last plane you'd expect to see hugging treetops. Designed as a high-altitude beast, the Thunderbolt was built to cruise where air was thin, to meet enemy fighters above the clouds and escort heavy bombers into Germany. Big, heavy, not nimble in the way you'd imagine for low-level strafing. Its controls were heavy, its profile bulky, its whole soul tuned to thin air and long climbs. A bruiser by design, not a skirmisher. That mismatch made the idea of hedgehopping sound insane. And yet, buried inside that rugged frame was the raw, accidental power that would let it survive where sleeker fighters might simply break. It wasn't designed for this dirt-level war. The P-47 was a bulky 7-ton bruiser built for thin air, huge fuselage, broad wings, and a monster 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial that howled like a freight train. But those very faults became strengths at treetop height. Weight gave stability when you were skimming bends and hedgerows. The massive engine delivered brutal acceleration to zip out of danger, and the air-cooled radial shrugged off damage that would cripple a delicate inline motor. In short, the Thunderbolt's brute toughness and raw power turned an ungainly heavy fighter into something accidentally perfect for smashing into the ground fight. The Thunderbolt's real superpower was brute resilience, not finesse, not agility, but the ability to take a beating and keep flying. A 7-ton airframe and that 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney didn't just shrug off cannon fire, they ate trees, wires, and rough landings for breakfast and still carried you home. Steel ribs creaked, oil coolers bled, paint peeled, but the airplane kept its teeth. Pilots learned to trust that mass and momentum could turn the landscape from an enemy into a cushion. Risky, yes, but survivable. And when those men rolled back into base, they didn't come empty-handed. They came back with impossible souvenirs. Tree branches jammed in the landing gear, belly panels shredded from tangling treetops, streaks of sap and torn paint where the earth had nicked the metal. They grinned, grim, a little stunned, and cleaned what could be cleaned. To the pilots, it was proof they'd lived. To the men on the flight line, it was data they could use. The P-47s rolled home battered and bizarre. Branches in the wheels, belly panels shredded, oil streaks from miracles of survival. Ground crews could have written it off as damage reports. Instead, the guys in coveralls saw a pattern, a set of repeatable stress points screaming for answers. They didn't shrug and move on. They leaned in, tracing the gouges with calloused fingers,
sketching fixes on oil-stained benches, treating each near miss like a lesson. Suddenly, the hangar hummed with purpose. Plates, reinforcements, clever little tweaks born of necessity. What looked like failure was the raw material for a new kind of airplane. They didn't wait for doctrinal permission. Workshops that had been patching punctured engines turned into improvisation labs. Mechanics and engineers ripped panels off Thunderbolts, bolted on armor to the belly, shielded oil coolers, tweaked gunsights, and strengthened landing gear.
Wiring was rerouted, instruments simplified. Every change answered one brutal question. How do you make a 7-ton fighter survive skimming treetops at 400 miles an hour? The work was ugly and urgent, field expedients welded together with whatever was on hand. But the planes that rolled back onto the line were no longer the same. They literally bolted an extra skin onto the Thunderbolt, quarter-inch steel plating riveted to the belly, not to stop cannon shells, but to take the shock when a wingtip kissed a tree. At treetop speeds, you don't need armor against tracers. You need something that makes a branch feel like a bruise instead of a funeral. The plating let pilots push closer to the ground, scrape past hedgerows, and live to tell the tale. Tree limbs became trophies stuck in landing gear, not death sentences. And it was only the first of many field fixes. Ground crews went to work. They reinforced oil coolers with armor and shields so a branch or a chunk of shrapnel wouldn't kill the engine. Gunsights were recalibrated, angled and slaved for fleeting ground bursts, tuned to compensate for high speed and tiny reaction windows. It was brutal field engineering, ugly, ingenious, and deadly. The Thunderbolt was being remade for a different kind of war. The P-47 was no longer just a fighter. It was mutating into something else entirely. A purpose-built hedge-hopping monster, equal parts tank and predator. Pilots came back with tree branches snagged in the landing gear and shredded belly panels like proof of some impossible near miss. And the mechanics answered by turning brute strength into survivability. Quarter-inch steel underbellies, reinforced oil coolers, gunsights tuned for high-speed strafing, and a rugged airframe that could take the punishment of scraping the earth. What started as desperate improvisation became a doctrine, a heavy, roaring machine engineered not for the thin air, but for the dangerous, low-down art of ambush. But how long could this dominance last? The P-47 hedgehoppers had ripped a hole in the Luftwaffe's sense of security, but Germany wasn't a nation that accepted humiliation quietly. The Germans were masters of adaptation, veteran tacticians, ruthless analysts, backed by a sprawling war machine. They would study the raids. They would move guns. They would tweak doctrine and exploit any predictable pattern. Every slammed runway and stunned mechanic would be fuel for a counter. The question hung over every Allied briefing: can speed and surprise hold up against an enemy who learns fast? What would their response be? When the reports hit the Luftwaffe High Command, they read like a nightmare. Quiet, rear-echelon airfields, places thought safe behind the front, were being savaged by ghost-like strikes. Aircraft shredded on the ramps, mechanics trapped in the open. Entire squadrons suddenly wiped out without warning. Radar blips turned to useless noise. Flak crews found themselves shooting at ghosts. It wasn't random sabotage or a one-off raid. The pattern was surgical, relentless, and impossible to predict. Commanders who had treated their rear areas as sanctuaries suddenly faced the terrifying fact that the war had been forced to move where they least expected it. Gallant didn't read the reports like a bureaucrat. He felt them like a boot to the gut. As one of Germany's top aces and the fighter force commander, he could see the math at a glance. Aircraft ruined on the ground were just as lethal to his war effort as planes lost in the air, and far cheaper for the attacker to produce. That realization turned alarm into action. He understood this wasn't a handful of lucky raids, but a strategic wound,
a new form of air power that could wreck readiness before a scramble ever began, and he knew the Luftwaffe couldn't afford to ignore it. Adolf Galland saw the math in an instant. A fighter wrecked on the tarmac was just as lethal to German air power as one punched out of the sky, but it cost the attacker almost nothing. No prolonged dogfight, no expensive risk, just surprise and a short burst of deadly accuracy. That simple arithmetic turned a series of nuisance raids into a strategic emergency. If airfields could be rendered unusable overnight, entire squadrons could be shackled without ever facing an opposing pilot. He couldn't treat this as isolated vandalism. This was a battlefield problem, and it demanded an urgent, systemic response. On April 19, 1944, Germany's ace-turned-commander Adolf Galland slapped his name on Directive 487, a desperate last-ditch order aimed squarely at stopping the hedgehoppers. He called for immediate countermeasures, move the flak, set up spotter networks, harden airfields. It was a reactive gambit born of alarm, the opening move in a frantic scramble to reclaim the low ground. Galland's Directive 487 didn't mince words. Haul the flak forward. Cannons that had once sat back in layered defense were shoved to the airfield fences, set to blast at treetop attackers. Crews scrambled to move rails, crated shells, and plant guns where they could see the horizon. An urgent, clumsy attempt to plug a hole the hedgehoppers had blown wide open. It was only the first of several desperate measures. Galland's answer was to turn the countryside into a human radar. Networks of civilian spotters were recruited. Bell towers and farmhouses turned into listening posts. Field telephones and coded reports linking village to airfield. Farmers, school teachers, even bakers were taught to watch the skyline and raise the alarm at the first sign of a low-flying intruder. A neat fix on paper, at least. They shoved the guns forward and set up 1,000 pairs of civilian eyes across the countryside. On paper, it looked tidy. Flak to meet low-level attacks, spotters to shout warnings. In practice, it was almost all for nothing. The hedgehoppers used the land as a blind. Hills, orchards, and church steeples swallowed their approach. P-47s hit the flak crews before the cannons could even traverse. Warnings came too late, and radar and lookouts were left chasing ghosts. The Germans had tried to harden the airfields, but these attacks had already slipped under every line they'd drawn. They started using hills and forests like a blind, hugging ridgelines, slipping under tree crowns, threading river valleys until the airfields suddenly loomed. 1 second there was nothing, the next the thunderbolts were on top of the field, 50 caliber slashes cutting into flak positions so fast the crews couldn't even man their guns. The strikes were surgical and gone before the smoke cleared, leaving stunned defenders and a growing sense that nothing could stop these ghost attacks. Even worse for the Germans, the quiet network of civilian spotters they trusted became a Trojan horse. Farmers, shopkeepers, and the very eyes on the horizon were quietly turned by the resistance into saboteurs in plain sight. They phoned in sightings that never happened. They reported aircraft where there were none. They fed German commanders a steady diet of false alarms, timed, tailored, lethal. The result was chaos. Fighters and flak crews sprinting after ghosts. Batteries repositioned to the wrong sector, precious hours wasted. While Luftwaffe patrols chased phantom contacts, the P-47s were free to strike real targets far away, unseen and unopposed. Even worse for the Germans, the French resistance didn't simply infiltrate the spotter network, they weaponized it, deliberately feeding German commanders false reports of enemy sightings. Farmers filed bogus alerts. Lookouts pointed the Luftwaffe the wrong way. Radio rooms lit up with noise. Commanders chased shadows across the countryside, while the real P-47s slipped in low, struck hard, and were gone before anyone realized they'd been hit. Deception became as deadly as any bomb. German patrols sprinted off in the wrong direction, engines roaring over empty fields, while the real threat slipped away to the west. Spotters pointed them toward phantom contacts, and Luftwaffe fighters chased shadows across the map, dozens of miles from the P-47s that swept in low, struck hard, and vanished before anyone could find them. It was confusion turned into a weapon. It worked, brutally and brilliantly, but it came at a price that couldn't be measured in enemy planes alone. Men who survived missions came back hollowed out, eyes wide with a kind of exhausted terror. Nights were short, and the mess hall quieted as more empty chairs accumulated. The flying was physically savage. Wrestling a 7-ton Thunderbolt at treetop speed drains you in a way no textbook ever described. And the mental toll was worse. Constant hypervigilance, twitchy hands, a habit of pushing limits until luck ran out. Victory had a bitter edge. And the cruel irony was this. The deadliest threats weren't always Jerry's in the sky, but the ground itself. It wasn't the Messerschmitts that did most of the killing. It was the Earth itself. The ordinary things you never imagine as weapons until you're screaming past them at 400 miles an hour. Thin power and telephone lines hung invisible across a summer sky. Tree branches snagged wingtips. Church steeples and weather vanes loomed like ambushes. Even a single crow hitting a canopy could end a life in an instant. The P-47 pilots learned to fear the map as much as the enemy. Every hedge, wire, and fence post became a potential executioner, turning skill and courage into a fragile, exhausting gamble. The deadliest threats weren't always enemy guns. Sometimes they were ordinary things you never saw coming. Power lines, nearly invisible at 400 miles per hour, became flying guillotines, slicing through wings and cockpits with a single, catastrophic whisper. 9 P-47s were claimed that way in just 2 months. At treetop speed, there was no time to react, no room to fix a mistake. A snapped wing, a ruptured fuel tank, a plane rolling into the trees. Men who survived watched friends die in the most mundane ways and felt the slow creep of fear and exhaustion set into every mission. Then there were the birds. If power lines were flying guillotines, birds became flying flak, little, lethal missiles you never saw until they were already inside the cockpit. A lone crow at 400 miles an hour could punch through a canopy like shattering glass, spray the pilot with splinters, blind him for a heartbeat, and turn a controlled run into a frantic, impossible scramble. There was no glorious enemy to blame, no warning flare, just a small, stupid animal that could end you as surely as a 20mm shell. That kind of random, petty danger ate at men. It turned courage into a tense, brittle thing, worn down by the simplest mischance. The psychological strain was immense. It wasn't the fear of a glorious dogfight that wore pilots down. Dogfights had rules, a rhythm, even a cruel poetry to them. This was noiseless, petty terror stretched across every mission. Hour after hour, you sat hunched over instruments and landmarks, senses pinned like a trapped animal, knowing a single missed cue could end you without fanfare. The things that killed were tiny and mundane. A crow striking a canopy, an invisible wire sliced at 400 miles an hour, a treetop you misjudged by a hair. And because the threat was so banal, it gnawed at you constantly, eroding steadiness and courage. What ate at them was the gnawing, constant terror of making a simple mistake, clipping a single tree, misjudging a wire, that would kill you instantly and without glory. There was no brass band victory, no cinematic duel. Death here was sudden, mundane, absurdly indifferent. You flew not for headlines, but to thread invisible gaps between hedgerows and telephone poles, measuring missions in inches and heartbeats. Fatigue stacked like rounds in a drum. Tiny errors accumulated until one landed like a verdict. Pilots who'd once chased scores found themselves shackled to a new, quieter fear. Some quit. Others pushed harder, and commanders had to pull a few back before luck ran out. The grind was brutal and unglamorous. Pilots who'd once banked and bled in dogfights found themselves locked in an endless fight with their own machines. Hands cramped on cold metal,
shoulders burning from yanking the stick, eyes raw from hours of wind and glare as the ground rushed up and blurred into a continuous threat. It wasn't cinematic heroism, it was physical punishment. Even the celebrated aces, men who'd survived impossible odds in the sky, found their nerves frayed and their bodies failing, and some quietly asked for transfers rather than risk another twitched reflex that would kill them. But where some stepped away, others only doubled down on the danger. Others grew overconfident, drunk on adrenaline and the taste of success, pushing margins they'd never been taught to test, hugging trees closer, whizzing over villages with a cocky grin, until the long grind of low-level work eroded reflexes and judgment. Near misses stacked up like whispered warnings. Commanders watched the trend and the casualty lists and made a cold, necessary call. Ground the risk-takers before their luck ran out. It was humiliating. It was pragmatic. Lives were saved by clipping wings and egos alike, a bitter trade that kept the squadrons intact for the larger fight coming next. Spring folded into summer of 1944, and the hedgehopping campaign hit its peak. No longer an experimental trick, but a full-blown doctrine honed by blood and sleepless nights. Pilots who had once been terrified of trees now flew with surgical bravado. Mechanics had armored bellies and tuned engines for one brutal purpose. Nervous laughter mixed with prayers in the briefing tents. Radios crackled with last checks. Everyone knew what was coming. The invasion of Europe, D-Day, was hours away, and the entire plan depended on crippling the Luftwaffe before the first landing craft hit the beaches. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The success of the entire D-Day operation depended on one crucial factor: absolute Allied air supremacy over the beaches. If the skies weren't theirs, landing craft would be slaughtered, supply lines severed. The invasion would unravel before boots even hit sand. That meant neutralizing the Luftwaffe not in months, but in hours. Blinding their scouts, wrecking their runways, shredding their ability to scramble a coherent defense. It was a brutal, surgical job. Deny the enemy the option to contest the landings. And that brutal calculus is why the hedge-hopping P-47s would not be a sideshow. They would be the sharp edge of the invasion itself. The hedge-hopping P-47s were chosen to be the tip of the spear, the razor's edge meant to paralyze the Luftwaffe before the invasion even began, not by grand dogfights, but by sudden brutal raids that would shred German air power on the ground and snuff out any hope of a coherent response. Command pushed these bulky, battered fighters into a role nobody really designed them for, because the stakes left no room for orthodoxy. Protect the beaches, protect the landing craft, buy the soldiers those first terrible minutes. Pilots checked guns and grit, engines rumbled like caged beasts, and somewhere a clock started its last countdown toward June 6th. June 6th, 1944. 90 minutes before the first landing craft was due to hit the Normandy beaches, the assault began. It wasn't tentative, it was all in. Hundreds of thunderbolts roared off English strips, dropping low and slicing across the channel like a blade. Timetables, radio calls, and a desperate hope held it together. This pre-dawn thunder was the curtain raiser for history. 300 heavy fighters, actually 289 P-47 Thunderbolts, screamed out of England, engines roaring, metal and thunder moving as one brutal wave. They skimmed the channel, then split like a blade over northern France, treetops whipping past at a heartbeat pace. Pilots hunched in armor, eyes fixed on the ground below, minds tuned to one cold purpose: strike before the Luftwaffe even knew they were there. Their mission was brutal and exact. Blanket every Luftwaffe base within a 150-mile radius of the coast in one synchronized shock. No gaps, no second chances. Hundreds of thunderbolts would fan out low and fast, striking simultaneously so pilots couldn't scramble, mechanics couldn't man guns, and command couldn't organize a coherent response before the sky was already lost.
The timing was surgical. A thunder of P-47s crossed the horizon and, like a blade, sliced into Kriel exactly when German fighters were taxiing and lining up for their morning patrols. There was no scramble, no warning to the men on the ground, just metal screaming, engines at full, and the moment before defense could even breathe had already passed. It was a massacre. The Thunderbolts tore down the runway like steel hounds, roaring low, guns spitting, slashing through parked FW-190s before crews could move. Smoke and flame licked the tarmac as shattered planes rolled and burned. 18 German aircraft were gone in minutes. The airfield erupted in chaos. And that lightning strike at Kriel was only the beginning. Elsewhere, the fury repeated. Across northern France, the onslaught was relentless. P-47s screamed in low, surgical runs. Airfields burned, communications melted, radar stations knocked silent. Runways became smoking craters. Telephone poles and wires collapsed. Maintenance sheds and fuel dumps went up in black plumes. It wasn't random strafing. It was coordinated, systemic destruction designed to blind and paralyze the Luftwaffe before it could even react. The Luftwaffe was caught completely flat-footed, their command and control shattered in minutes. Radio traffic became a jumble. Controllers yelled into dead channels while runways smoked and radar screens blinked with nothing but noise. Orders couldn't be relayed fast enough, squadrons were scrambled blind, and pilots lifted off with no coordinated vector, sent chasing phantoms. Telephone lines and relays that tied airfields to command posts were severed or blazing, and ground crews froze, watching their planes burn. It was as if Germany's defensive brain had been cleaved in two. No coherent response, only scattered, confused sorties that walked straight into ambushes, leaving the sky for the taking. By the time American soldiers were fighting for their lives on the sands of Omaha Beach, the German air response was one of confusion and paralysis. Command centers were blinded, runways were smoky graves, radio nets choked with conflicting reports. Pilots who might have turned the tide never got clear orders, and units that tried to scramble found their fields strafed, their defenses silenced. What should have been a roaring, organized counterstrike became staccato bursts of desperation, if anything at all. That absence above the invasion beaches gave battered troops a sliver of breathing room, and it bought the Allies the one thing they needed most: time. All day, the sky above the Armada was effectively closed. Against that vast mass of ships, the Luftwaffe could only scrape together 2 reconnaissance sorties, 2 tiny, desperate probes where a fleet of hundreds should have been guarded. That absence spoke louder than gunfire. It meant confusion at the highest levels, broken command, and a force too disoriented to contest the air. The invasion fleet moved like a protected colossus, and any lone German plane that tried to peek through the curtain risked being seen, engaged, and wiped out before it could send back a single useful word. Both German planes were promptly shot down, gone before they could blink or radio a warning. No eyes in the sky, no early alerts. That tiny shred of Luftwaffe reconnaissance was snuffed out in minutes, and with it went the Wehrmacht's last sliver of situational awareness over the channel. The hedgehoppers hadn't just torn up airfields, they'd severed the enemy's nerve endings. Suddenly, German commanders were making decisions with blindfolds on, reacting to ghosts and rumors, while Allied formations streamed toward the beaches. In a war decided by timing and information, those 2 little planes being wiped out mattered more than anyone on the ground could know. Thanks to the hedgehoppers, the sky over Normandy belonged entirely to the Allies. What began as a reckless, rule-breaking experiment had become strategic dominance. Low, fast, and invisible attacks shredded German airfields, crippled command and control, and left the Luftwaffe scrambling. By dawn on D-Day, the enemy couldn't mount a coordinated response. Reconnaissance was scant, fighters were grounded or destroyed, and the invasion fleet crossed the channel under a blanket of Allied air power. That brutal, dangerous tactic didn't just win aerial battles. It carved a corridor of safety to the beaches and helped make the entire invasion possible. The hedge-hopping campaign had been a resounding success. What started as a reckless experiment had become a surgical weapon, striking radars, runways, and command hubs with such speed and surprise that the Luftwaffe's ability to respond collapsed at the exact moment it mattered most. Airfields burned while crews scrambled. Flak couldn't aim in time. Patrols chased ghosts fed by false reports. That sudden paralysis above France didn't just cost planes. It erased the Germans' hope of contesting the invasion airspace, buying the Allies the margin they needed to land and hold the beaches. It was proof that a small, brutal innovation could win a battle before it began. They flew low, fast, and unpredictably. Suddenly, the gospel of altitude is life was flipped on its head. Radar and flak were defeated by ground clutter. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots were ambushed before they could react, and P-47s slipped in like ghosts, strafing airfields and melting away into hedgerows. What began as a hush-hush experiment spread fast. After a few stunning successes, other units copied the method. Briefings were rewritten, and commanders learned to plan with the ground as an offensive tool. In a matter of months, a desperate improvisation became doctrine across the Allied air forces, brutal, efficient, and game-changing. That philosophy of flying low, fast, and unforgiving didn't vanish when the P-47s landed. It mutated and showed up wherever close air support mattered. In Korea and Vietnam, pilots learned again to hug the earth, to trade graceful dogfights for brutal, precise hits on targets the big bombers couldn't reach. In the A-10, you can see the Thunderbolt's stubborn DNA, armor, firepower, and a mission to survive long enough over the battlefield to make a difference. What started as a desperate gamble became doctrine, a lineage of aircraft and tactics built around one idea: if the rules are killing you, change them. What of Major Hub Zemke? He wasn't court-martialed. He was pulled into the light. Command, finally staring at results instead of doctrine, decorated him for the very audacity that had risked everything: medals, promotions, and the grudging respect of the brass. He never hid the danger he'd asked his men to take. He accepted responsibility so others wouldn't have to. More than personal glory, Zemke's reward was validation. Proof that leadership sometimes means breaking the rulebook when the rulebook is killing your people. His gamble rewrote priorities, survival and initiative over rigid procedure, and the Air Force would never look at air combat the same way again. In the end, Zemke's rebellion wasn't some reckless stunt. It was a hard, moral choice driven by math and mourning. He saw that training manuals could become traps when the enemy learned your moves. The real weapon turned out to be a mindset, the courage to ask uncomfortable questions, to scrap doctrine that was killing your men, and to risk blame for the chance to save lives. That willingness to rethink everything under pressure is what won them the skies. Not a shinier airplane, not a bigger bomb, but the stubborn, dangerous act of thinking differently when everything else was failing. The P-47 Thunderbolt was built to rule the high skies, but it found its deadliest purpose when men dragged it down and dared to break the book, turning a lumbering bruiser into a hedge-hopping weapon that rewrote air war. Major Zemke wasn't court-martialed, he was honored, because sometimes survival demands that you question the gospel and gamble everything on a new idea. Innovation is messy, terrifying, and often born from desperation. But when doctrine becomes a death sentence, the courage to improvise can change the course of history. When the rules are leading to certain failure, do you have the courage to write your own? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of military innovation.